fear I might be here as the light entertainment after the sort of incredible learning that's gone on in this room today. So my name's Tania Kovats, and I'm an artist, and I'm going to read... sorry. No, we can't hear. Oh, you can't hear. I'll go back. Thank you. So my name's Tania Kovats, and I'm going to read something about that I wrote recently about my drawing practice before I start talking about actual drawings. Drawing for me provides a focus, something to rest on, a place to drop an anchor. Giving time and space to the drawing is giving time and space to myself. Drawing is a unique physical and mental activity that can allow for creative absorption, offering an experience of slowing time down, that allows a space to open in the stream of thoughts, frustrations, emotions that clutter my mind. Drawing allows me to access my being mind over my thinking mind, promoting a heightening of senses and intuitive understandings, clarity and space to notice the detail, slow down, see things I might have missed, be a witness, care, worry at a problem, communicate, find meaning, celebrate, be curious, trust, dream, see the beauty of small things in ways that help me live and endure. Through drawing, the invisible becomes visible and communicable. Drawing makes the space and time to understand that the process is more important than the product. Through encountering this approach to drawing, I see the importance of not judging, of compassion, and sensing connectedness. Drawing practice helps me cultivate patience. It is worth the wait for the drawing to be what I want it to be. Drawing helps me develop perspective, distance, and intimacy. Through drawing, I learn to be present, be playful, and be brave. I try to appreciate my thinking hand, the knowledge and wisdom that lives in the body, in the mind's eye, the creative, courageous, liquid self. So I take a breath, I make a mark, I leave a trace, and I understand this is only ever something against nothing. So I'm going to show you some of my something against nothings now. So I developed a kind of more intimate relationship with drawing through the process of making a book that I was invited to do, and I made this book called The Drawing Book in 2004 whilst the Henry Moore Drawing Fellow, which was housed at UWE. And I selected drawings that I was engaging with in some way to tell a visual narrative. I think I'm much more a kind of Instagram thinker than an academic thinker. So my book was mainly pictures. And I travelled through drawings that I thought I could make connections, because I think drawing belongs to everyone, not just artists. And I think drawings can talk to each other. I could kind of read out information about each of these drawings, and this is a solar wit, but that's what the book does. I'm just going to show the pictures for now because of time as well. So trying to compare that Blake drawing to the solar wit folding of space, because I think both drawings fold space, even though they were made in completely different contexts. But I remember a show that was curated at the Whitechapel by Michael Craig Martin, that put things like a contemporary drawing next to a Michelangelo drawing, and they could talk to each other. So I took that through into this published form. I'm interested in the drawings that scientists make as proofs, engineers make, as well as performative drawings. This is a Paul McCarthy drawing of him dragging himself through space, measuring his studio. This is a Thomas Wegener proof of plate tectonics in the world. Early geological cross-sections of land managed to kind of map material and time in a new kind of codified drawing system. So, I'm as excited by drawings that make themselves as well. This is a seismograph from Caltech, as well as the kind of inner drawings that manifest from artists. This is Louise Bourgeois, a Smithson heap of language. So all trying to kind of represent landscape in different ways, but finding very different methodologies to do so. This is a Richard Long, rolling rocks down a hill. A remarkable Duchamp drawing, tongue-in-cheek. So I wanted to kind of look at various themes in the drawing book by a whole range of practitioners, not just artists, to talk about different subjects. So it spoke about landscape, it spoke about the body, it spoke about the dream. This is a Dürer description of a dream. It talked about death as well. So I took the reader on a visual kind of journey through books, and the book was an invitation for that reader to make their own drawing book of all the drawings they loved and had come across and help them make sense of the world. I was trained as a sculptor, so this is an example of an early sculpture. Landscape and how we mediate landscape has been my kind of central subject. So I modelled things in clay and cast them and then set them into plinths. And these were often landscapes that had been eroded by water in some way to kind of reveal themselves. And my drawing practice had a very kind of obvious kind of equivalence to the sculptures. So I would treat the white paper like the plinth, or I'd even draw the sculptures. The bottom drawing is a drawing I made of a sculpture once it existed. There was kind of polite exchange between drawing and object. Though landscape is my subject, I can't draw landscape. So I look to cartography as a kind of method of drawing landscape, and I made this map with the British Geological Survey in Nottingham, which is a fully kind of testable geology for an island I invented, and there is gold on the island somewhere, and a volcano. I took some of those cartographic symbols and made them into sculpture. So this is a work at Kilda. I often work in the public realm, so kind of the whole conversation around how work relates to audience is important to me. And I'm taking the viewpoint symbol, scaling it up and putting it into the landscape. I use the atlas a lot in my drawing systems of landscape. Sometimes I set up a kind of structure for my drawing process that I just have to follow through. So this was all the islands of the British Isles, and I draw onto like a mapping translucent paper and trace each island very like an ink blot, but they do have a kind of cartographic reference, and then I dissolve them in layers over the top of each other, so their sort of cartographic certainty is no longer secure. And I've gone on to make several drawing series of islands stroke ink blots in this way. This is all the islands of the Arctic Ocean. Other drawings I make are quite field drawings where I develop a mark that I try and let it grow itself. So often looking at kind of landscape in kind of crystalline form. So looking at the sort of rock formation as in a sample of a rock, of a crystal. How do things make themselves? And some drawings I'm literally filling time. And I know that's all that is. So very much something against nothing, totally futile exercises of making a mark that I just want to fill a page with. Drawings, we haven't necessarily talked about this. As an artist, I can't always make big, expensive sculptures that I want to make, but I can always make a drawing. So that's why I make more drawings than sculptures. So there's an economy to the practice as well. Then my kind of relationship with landscape sculpture dematerialised somewhat with this work, which was Meadow, where I took a wildflower meadow from Bath to London via the inland waterway systems. And this was always a layer of the landscape that I'd been trying to peel off so I could see the kind of geology and formation of landscape underneath to observe. But this time I actually made a piece of work with that top layer. And the meadow asked the question, when you move through a landscape, does it move through you? What is the exchange when you're moving through landscape, tracing a line? I mean, I felt the work was a drawing, but just in a very different form. So I kind of followed a line via the kind of waterways of the UK until it was eventually local to me, in the East End of London, on the canals there. And these were my kind of thinking spaces, walking the canal paths, these kind of urban wildernesses. But initially, meadow very much travelled through itself. There were meadows either side before it got to London. And my audience were a towpath audience, largely. And it completely kind of collapsed the very polite distance between the art object, the artist, and the audience. Suddenly, we were all in the same space together. I made another kind of landscape work in response to this drawing, which is the Uffington White Horse. It's just outside Oxford on the hills there in the chalk downlands. And it's a remarkable drawing because it's been in continuous usage for over 2,000 years, which means people have redrawn it. It hasn't disappeared. So this was my first kind of encounter with collective drawing, social drawing, and drawing that went deep into kind of human time and the traces that we leave. So during a 2-year fellowship at the Archaeological Department of Oxford University, I looked a lot at contemporary archaeological theory about the archaeology of us, and decided to go looking for the white horse as a kind of mythical archetype in our material culture. So not necessarily looking into deep history. And this was the opening outside Pier in Shoreditch, and we had PC Tracy on Boris attend the opening. I'd made a museum of the White Horse in a horse box that I took travelling around various sites. So starting in London, then we went back to the hillside. We went to race courses where horse worship is alive and well. And I made a collection through trawling through eBay and various sources of the white horse in our material culture. And I was trained, because my interest in different kind of disciplines of drawing, I was trained by the draftsperson at the university in archaeological drawing, which is a very particular system of notation where different materials have different marks. You always draw at whole scale or one-to-one scale, and it's kind of acknowledged as a very useful edited tool of representation and communication. Desert Orchid died during my preparation for this project, so there was a white horse on the cover of every newspaper in the UK, and obituaries to a white horse, so it kind of gave me some confidence that white horses were different. So I drew many things that were in the collection, as well as the Museum of the White Horses library, and I've continued to draw books, possibly more than I read books. After making these two kind of travelling, fairly demanding artworks, I took a sabbatical with my partner and a very patient son, and we went to South America for 6 months. And again, as I've already declared, I couldn't draw the landscapes we were in, but I drew our guides to them. So my road atlas, my trekking guide, and Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle, which was one of my kind of companions for the journey. Also during this time, I was invited to make a proposal for the Darwin Bicentenary work at the Natural History Museum, which so I made a proposal based on this page in Darwin's notebook, which is one of my favourite drawings in the world because it represents a moment of coming into kind of realisation, and I love the top of the page says I think, and then the thinking has to become a drawing. Darwin couldn't straight away put it into words. He had to visualise this branching tree form to express his realisation about the theory of evolution, which I think is one of our most impressive ideas as yet. And this was the resulting work. I proposed to take a 200-year-old oak tree and effectively slice it down through the branches, stem and roots. So taking a living harvestable tree from a sustainable source, I might add, in woodlands that have been managed for centuries, and asking this tree to allow us to draw it with itself. So taking this slice that effectively kind of turned this three-dimensional thing into a two-dimensional thing. And this was the drawing that helped kind of manage all that cutting and sectioning and keeping this very complex jigsaw puzzle together until it was placed into the ceiling of the Natural History Museum as a public work. Which gave me a kind of love of wood grain and the lines that exist in some living things that describe time. So I sourced, again from similar sustainable sources, slices through ancient fallen oak trees and redrew their timelines. This piece is called 282 because that's how many years the tree had rings or had lived for. My practice went through quite a big change when I moved out of London. I now live very rurally by water in the southwest of England. And this is one of the first pieces I made after that move. So I feel what I do now is I draw water. And that doesn't always mean drawing as in making representations. It also means drawing as in to extract, like drawing water from a well. This is a piece called Rivers, where I was invited to make a piece for Jupiter Artland, which is just outside Edinburgh, and I collected water from 100 rivers from around the UK and housed them in a boathouse that was built over the water at Jupiter Artland. So taking this moving, dynamic kind of manifestation of time passing and making it still. It's a very, very still piece of work. From that piece of work, I went on to make a big sister work in collaboration with the Fruit Market Gallery in Edinburgh. I'm amazed how many times they've come up today. Fiona should be here. So this piece is called All the Seas, and I wanted to bring water from all the world's seas to one place, which I couldn't do on my own. It was a participatory work, and in kind of anthropological terms, it relates very strongly to ideas of gift culture. So people gifted the water to the project, and then the water was gifted back in the work. I didn't collect all the seas I wanted because sometimes my network couldn't reach some seas, and they were represented in the work by an empty bottle. And I got more water than I was anticipating. So that's the work in its final form. Whilst doing that act of collecting the water, I went through another kind of publishing processes where I collected drawings that reflect on water. This publication called Drawing Water looked at drawing as a mechanism for exploration and included, again, a wide range of drawing practice. So this is an illustration for Lewis Carroll's Hunting of the Snark, a perfectly empty ocean map that the crew were very happy with. This is a particular kind of convention of drawing portolans that were made by people on boats describing the coast. So they were often made by sailors, and they work from one harbour to another. Very beautiful kind of drawing system. William Daniell, who set off to circumnavigate the UK in a sailing ship, drawing all the way, comparing that to a Turner sketch of Land's End, or via Selman, drawing of the surface of the sea. A page from Donald Crowhurst's logbook as his mental deterioration is kind of recorded in his kind of scribblings in the logbooks. They become less and less precise. Marie Tharp, an amazing geographer, mathematician, outstanding visualization cartographer, who took on the task of drawing the ocean bed, so under the sea, in these first maps of what's going on at the bottom of the sea, maps that are still very testable. How drawings might actually have political impact. This description of how boats were ergonomically set up, I use that word in parenthesis, was published in 1789, and people first visualizing how bodies were actually fit into these slave ships did so much more to mobilize the anti-slave movement in this country than a whole kind of raft of data and statistics had done up till that point. So the Drawing Water project was how do we represent our liquid selves back to ourselves? How have we represented the sea? But again, in a very kind of a broad sense, not just kind of artists with their maritime visualizations. And during this period, I was unmaking information as well. So I work with, I love the atlas as a source, but I know they become redundant very quickly. They're obsolescent, often. So I work with old atlases that I paint out the information, just leaving the information about the seas. And sometimes I reconfigure those atlases to make new kind of continents. So there's a lot of whitewashing on all the pages. I'll also make drawings with salt and ink, so kind of almost setting up the drawing. Like I say, I make it rather than draw it, but I was setting up a kind of tidal evaporation process in the drawing, so the salt recrystallizes in ways that I can't necessarily anticipate. And sometimes I'll make those drawings onto hydrological charts as well, the sort of sea maps that we make. This is as close as I get, perhaps, to drawing the sea. It's from a drawing that I've made repeatedly. I call it my sea marks. They're an attempt to just draw the energy of water. And what I do in the drawing is I'm attempting to get to the horizon. The horizon is the important line. It's my favourite kind of place, if you like, my favourite line in the world, particularly the horizon line between sky and sea. And I'll use a brush loaded with whatever I'm drawing with to discharge one mark. These are made onto ceramic tiles and fired because we tile our wet spaces, we tile our bathrooms and our swimming pools and various other wet spaces. So there seemed a congruence with making this work for potentially a wet space. I was asked by the National Trust to make a work in response to their coastal custodianship and their Project Neptune that was having an anniversary. So I said I didn't want to make a work about a particular beach, but I wanted to make a work about our very amazingly dynamic tidal coastal landscape, which for me meant asking, could I make a bell at Land's End with this itinerant foundry? So this was an event on the autumn equinox. The bell was cast on the beach in front of a kind of gathering of people. It was baptised in the sea the next day. And then that bell was installed in Somerset House in London and rung at high tide on the River Thames. Because the tide in the UK, the high tide comes barreling in off the Atlantic. Huge amount of high tide water comes in and it splits at Land's End and then envelops the country and meets again in the waters where the Thames discharges, which is why the Thames is such an amazingly dynamic tidal river, and also why that coast is very subject to storm surge as well. An accompanying piece for this was a digital drawing that stripped out all the tidal information from the UK and was programmed to move with the time of the tide. So it was a very slow-moving drawing that was live online for a year, and you could see where high tide was in the country. After that period of research and thinking, I was invited to make a response to James Lovelock's Gaia Theory as the James Lovelock award holder in 2015. So I chose to look at his Gaia Theory in relation to seas and oceans, and the idea that the planet is the largest living thing on the planet, which started as quite a kind of revolutionary idea when it was first kind of birthed, akin to Darwin's evolution, but certainly within climate science developments, Gaia Theory is pretty a central foundation of much of what we understand about climate science, and certainly as Gaia 2 is emerging. So I took the shape of the world's oceans, so stripping out kind of globes, flattening them. Again, there's another drawing convention I really liked about how you kind of visualize the globe, which are called these, they're called gauze, the kind of canoe shapes that you can roll around a globe that can divide up into, well, I've got my globe was divided into 24, and taking that as a template to then scale up to make large steel bowls that are in the shape of the three largest oceans. They were first shown at Museum of Science and Industry in Manchester, which could be the place, you could argue, where our kind of carbon footprint began. And this is a shot from the show Future City at Modern Art Oxford that was last autumn. And in the background's another set of the island drawings. So these are all the islands of all the seas. So this is the kind of sister drawing to the All the Seas water collection work, where I arranged drawings from the atlas according to which sea they were in. Some of, again, the sea mark drawings, one that reoccurs for me. This is showing a section of it in the Maritime Museum at Queen's House. This is another one I made last September for a show in Exeter. So I'm not free of this drawing, whatever it is. Another kind of, this is my most glamorous commission ever, because I was commissioned by Tideway, who are putting in the super sewer for London, to make an artwork. And I proposed to them, I wanted to make a newspaper instead of a book this time. And I appointed the Thames, the River Thames, as the editor of the newspaper. And I wanted her to tell her stories through this platform. So my newspaper was called Dirty Water, and it contained various kind of recollections, stories. She was losing her memory or chronology a bit, so things would get a little bit muddled, but she could remember Canaletto staring at her so long to make this drawing, and she could remember Bazalgette's tunnels and sewer system going in, and she was really excited about the Tideway new super sewer because it meant she was going to get cleaned up. So she was my storyteller for this. I really enjoy writing as part of my practice, and this was different for me to have to write in someone else's voice. But and the paper was given out at 40 stations along the River Thames at low tide on the autumn equinox, so a kind of day of half and half, and just given out to anyone that wanted a free public artwork. I made an equivalent work for the River Exe, which is local to me, commissioned by the Environment Agency, whose focus was flooding. And I'm making another one, I think, hopefully for a show I'm doing about the Tweed, which is on the border between Scotland and England. So increasingly, environmental concerns are driving my practice. I had a brief fellowship at Exeter University, working with the Global Systems Institute there, which is an amazing kind of gathering of citizen science and world-leading climate science, because I am looking for Darwin's tree of knowledge, visualizing climate change. The closest I've found at the moment, I invited a 200-strong symposium of climate scientists to do a drawing workshop with me. So they all drew climate change, and none of them have unlocked it yet, but this is Tim Lenton's. I think this feedback loop is one of the closest ways we have of visualising a really difficult problem to visualise. So I'm on the search for that. Any suggestions, things you might have seen? I think Extinction Rebellion are getting pretty close to visualising it. And I've been drawing this book for several years. It's Rachel Carson's The Sea Around Us, and I'm drawing every copy I can find of it, all the different publications. She was a remarkable scientist, marine biologist, and communicator. She writes like a poet about some of our biggest problems. Some of you may know her book, The Silent Spring. And I was invited by the Edinburgh Book Festival, because of these drawings, to run a series of kind of panels about this book, which was an interesting position to be put in. And as well as drawing books, I've been casting them. I've just finished a commission for the New Bodleian in Oxford, where I've cast books actually from my son's library. I call it library, but so within this massive kind of edifice of learning and history, I've inserted a very private space of reading. So there are casts of things like the Guinness Book of Records and his prospectus to Manchester University and his first book from when he was little. So a very kind of personal library put into this very public library. And I'm trying to draw the books that have helped me make sense of the world. This was my contribution to the Drawing Rooms auction this year, drawing of R.D. Lang, The Divided Self. And I made that just before going off to New Zealand, where I was invited as part of a group called Drawing Ecology to go to New Zealand and spend time on a kind of Maori piece of land that was very environmentally damaged. And I was part of the third funded group to be on this land. The first group were climate scientists, the second group were landscape architects, and the third group were artists. And there's some idea that by looking at this one little patch on the south of the North Island, it becomes a kind of model to look at some of the environmental challenges faced by the country. I do have a bit of history with New Zealand, because this was a piece I made when I was quite a baby artist called Virgin in a Condom that was part of a show in New Zealand, and this is what happened outside the gallery, because there was a disenfranchised Catholic community that went completely crazy about the fact that that sculpture was in that gallery. So I was quite nervous going back to New Zealand, but it was okay. I can supply a lot more information about this ecological drawing project, because if anyone's interested. This is the coastal area I was in. The dairy industry has kind of taken away natural kind of river courses. They've culverted the water, drained the land, polluted the rivers. It's a massive kind of environmental problem. I'm just showing you my accommodation. We all had to share one bed. It's very strange. Maori culture is very challenging to a Westerner, but what they offered in terms of indigenous or original knowledge of how to kind of talk about relationship with, these are other people that were there, Frances Whitehead, Judy Watson, I'll just keep showing pictures. This was also stayed at a really odd colonial place as well, but that's a separate thing. How they've kind of used their cultural understanding of the relationship with landscape to address ecological issues. There's a lot to take from this. In particular, this river, the Wanugo River, has been given legal rights, same legal rights as a human. My hope is to go and draw water for a work in New Zealand, but this would have to be made in kind of deep collaboration with local people and their sense of ownership over their water is something I haven't encountered before. Interesting challenge. These are some of the drawings I made there of just trying to learn various words for water. And this is the way I put the picture on my wall, because I felt like I was walking the surface of the planet very strongly down there in New Zealand. I came back from there and walked another river, the Tweed, for a project that I'm developing this summer in Berwick. So thinking about water as a boundary, the line between England and Scotland in our very kind of toxically divided country at the moment, just thinking how long will the union hold. So that's the work in development currently. I'm just back from delivering my first experience of this, drawing breath, which is something I've set up with a colleague of mine that's looking specifically at the relationship between drawing and meditation and how they kind of exchange. What is that exchange? What's the potential for that? We happen to do it in a very beautiful place in Italy where St. Francis of Assisi's withdrawal walk is in the hills above. There's a Piero in the village next door. And we made drawings as a small group that came out of meditation practices, came out of dynamic life drawing practices, came out of observational practice, but always predicated on various different forms of meditation and exploring kind of inner ecology. Sometimes we drew for each other, so you were just the brush rather than the artist. This is Joanna Lewis, who's here, the drawing she made in the waterfall somewhere. And this was my drawing that I made while we were there, which is just to say what a wild place it was. On one of our walks, we found wolf scat, which I have collected and will be framing up. So that's how wild a place we were in, and I feel like I did go a little feral out there. It was a very kind of non-critical space, but really interesting. I haven't fully processed it yet. And this is a drawing I've put in a show, very different to anything I've shown before, called Parallel Lines. It opens next week. I was asked to make a drawing in relation to a drawing from the Ingram collection, so mid-century, mainly sculptor's drawing. I chose Elizabeth Frink's Running Man and presented Running Man with Dancing Woman. And I make drawings like this a lot, but I never show them to anyone. So this is another interesting departure. So it's a figurative drawing with a shed snakeskin pinned to the drawing, and they're in kind of parallel or dialogue. And this is a very fresh drawing. Just been making some preparatory sketches for a commission that's going to be happening at St. Martin's in the Field that I'm basing on the idea of a spine that's in response, another kind of parallel situation to a magnificent Richter tapestry that's in this little chapel in the crypt. So I'm making, these are the drawings that will generate the ceramic work that comes out of it. Some tile tests that I'm doing for, this is yesterday's drawing, this is hot off the press. I've been asked to make a drawing, a water fountain for a design exhibition in Edinburgh, design event. So thinking about clean water available, trying to get rid of plastic bottles, more drinking fountains in public spaces. So again, it's kind of an activism as drawing, it's a purposeful drawing. And this was a drawing I made on Wednesday night because after spending a week thinking consciously about breathing, I want to try and draw lungs. And this is as close as I've got so far, and I'm making the drawing through blowing ink. So with lungs, of lungs. As you can see, that was my last image.